The first time they saw her she wasn't dressed for war, she wasn't even dressed like someone meant to be anywhere near the battlefield, yet there was something in the way she carried herself that drew every eye in the SEAL team. They had been flown into a dust-choked airstrip at the edge of a nameless desert city, their mission brief only half explained and their orders filled with the kind of vague phrasing that made seasoned operators wary. The brass had said they would have a guide, someone who knew the terrain and the people, someone who could get them into places satellites couldn't see and drones couldn't follow. They were expecting a man, maybe some grizzled tracker with sunburnt skin and lines carved deep from years of desert wind, but instead she appeared, slim, tall, with dark hair tied back beneath a faded scarf, eyes the color of the stormy sky just before the rain. She moved with a grace that wasn't practiced but natural, the kind you noticed in predators more than people, and though she said nothing at first her silence carried its own weight. Lieutenant Marcus Harlow, the SEAL team leader, exchanged quick glances with his men. These were professionals, hardened by deployments that had tested every nerve and bone in their bodies, and yet there was something about this woman that shifted the air around them, made them straighten unconsciously as though she were already commanding the field. When the colonel introduced her only by the name Falcon, the men thought it was a joke, some kind of code name for their contact, but the way she accepted it without flinching, without even blinking, told them it was more than a call sign. It was a reputation. The colonel didn't bother with explanations. He just said Falcon would take them through hostile territory, across ridgelines and ravines, through villages where every shadow might hide a rifle. She'll get you in and out alive, he added as if that settled it. The SEALs weren't easily convinced, but they had learned long ago that missions weren't about comfort, they were about survival, and if this mysterious woman was their lifeline then so be it. Falcon finally spoke when the colonel left, her voice low, steady, carrying an accent shaped by countless borders but softened by an authority that needed no volume. "You follow me, you listen, you live," she said, scanning their faces with eyes that seemed to weigh their worth in a single heartbeat. No one argued. Even the usually cocky Rodriguez, who could crack jokes in the middle of a firefight, held his tongue. She turned and walked toward the waiting vehicles without checking if they followed, as if she already knew they would. The drive was silent at first, the roar of the engines and the grind of sand under tires filling the air, but gradually the men began to notice how Falcon never stopped watching the horizon. Her eyes moved like radar, scanning ridges, valleys, even the circling birds overhead. Once, when they approached a narrow canyon, she raised a hand abruptly and the convoy halted. She got out without a word, crouched by the dust, and after a long moment stood again. "Detour," was all she said. Harlow frowned but didn't question her. They took the longer route she indicated, and half an hour later the canyon behind them erupted in the echo of distant detonations. An ambush laid for them, mines and tripwires triggered by the scouting party that had expected them to pass. The men glanced at each other, expressions grim, respect growing silently. Falcon hadn't just seen danger, she had smelled it in the dirt. As night fell, they set up a temporary camp. The desert stretched endless around them, dunes shifting like ghosts under the pale moon. The SEALs moved with quiet precision, setting watches, checking weapons, but their eyes always drifted back to her. She didn't sit with them, didn't eat their rations, didn't even seem to rest. Instead she climbed the ridge, perched like her namesake on a jagged stone, and kept her gaze on the darkness as if she could see farther than night itself. Harlow climbed up to her after a while, more out of curiosity than anything else. He had led men through hell and worse, seen locals who could fight with courage, guides who could track by starlight, but this woman unsettled him. "Falcon, huh?" he said lightly, testing her with a tone meant to draw out something human. She didn't smile. "Names mean less than what they stand for," she answered, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "Men here fear the Falcon. It strikes without warning, it never misses, and it leaves no sound but the silence afterward." Harlow studied her profile in the pale glow and understood why the name stuck. The next day proved her worth again. They had to cross a cluster of villages that intelligence had marked as hostile. Normally the team would have gone in by night, masked by darkness, but Falcon led them through in broad daylight, walking at a steady pace as though she belonged there. At first the SEALs thought it madness, but the reaction of the locals silenced their doubts. Old men nodded respectfully, children scattered but not in fear, and the armed young men watching from doorways lowered their weapons ever so slightly. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, but the weight of her presence carried something more powerful than words. Later Rodriguez whispered to Harlow, "Who the hell is she? They look at her like she's a legend." Harlow didn't answer. Deep down he suspected she was. By the third day the SEALs had stopped questioning her decisions. Falcon said stop, they stopped. She said move, they moved. She led them through a maze of ravines, across rivers that looked impassable until she found the hidden stones beneath, through markets where hostile eyes softened at her passing. Each time they survived something that should have killed them, the men grew quieter, their respect shifting from reluctant trust into something closer to awe. Yet she remained distant, never offering her story, never showing more than the cold precision of a blade honed for war. They wondered what loss or fire had forged her, but no one dared ask. Some truths they sensed were buried too deep. It wasn't until the night before their main objective that they saw another side of her. The mission was to extract a captured American journalist from a heavily guarded compound deep in enemy territory. The risk was high, the odds grim, and even seasoned operators felt the weight of it. Around the campfire that evening, tension hung heavy. Falcon sat apart as usual, but when she noticed one of the younger SEALs, Mason, sitting with his head in his hands, she approached. Her steps were silent, her presence sudden. "Fear is not weakness," she told him softly, startling him. "Fear sharpens you, keeps you alive. Only fools fight without it." Mason looked up, surprised, and for the first time her eyes held something other than steel. There was pain there, old and raw, and maybe that was why her words carried such truth. For a fleeting second the SEALs saw not just the predator but the human beneath, and it made her even more formidable. That night, as they lay in the cold silence of the desert, every man in the team knew one thing beyond doubt. Whatever storm awaited them inside that compound, they would follow Falcon into it without hesitation, because she had already led them through shadows that would have claimed lesser men. They didn't know her past, they didn't know her real name, but they knew why they called her Falcon. And soon they would learn the full weight of what that meant. The assault on the compound began in the blackest hours before dawn, when the desert seemed to hold its breath and even the wind paused in its endless sweep of sand. The SEALs moved with the discipline of shadows, every step calculated, every breath measured, yet it was Falcon who led them into the heart of danger. She had spent the night drawing crude maps in the dirt, pointing out guard rotations, weak points in the walls, the pattern of patrols that only someone with eyes like hers could have noticed. Harlow had watched her, trying to guess how she knew so much about a place intelligence had called impenetrable, but she never explained. She simply showed them where to step, where not to linger, and how to become part of the desert itself. Now, as they crawled toward the compound's perimeter, Harlow felt the weight of her presence ahead of them like a tether pulling them forward. When she raised her hand, they froze. When she moved, they flowed after her, silent as a tide. At the outer wall she scaled the stones like a creature born to heights, her scarf trailing like a shadow behind her. She reached the top, crouched low, and motioned for them to follow. One by one, heavily armed men trained for every kind of warfare imaginable placed their trust in her slender frame and followed into the lion's den. Inside, the compound was a maze of courtyards and narrow corridors, lit by faint lamps that threw more shadow than light. Falcon moved like water, slipping from cover to cover, signaling with the briefest of gestures. Twice she stopped them just before a patrol rounded the corner, saving them from exposure by no more than seconds. The men began to feel as though she had the enemy's movements etched into her blood. They reached the central building where the journalist was said to be held, a tall stone structure guarded by armed men at every door. Normally, a frontal assault would have been the only way, but Falcon shook her head. She led them along the wall, pressed her palm against a section of worn stone, and with a strength that belied her frame shifted a loose block wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Harlow stared, wondering how she had known it was there, but there was no time for questions. One by one the SEALs slipped inside, weapons ready, nerves taut. The journalist was held in a locked room upstairs, his face bruised, his body thin, but his eyes wide with disbelief when he saw who had come for him. Rodriguez cut the chains while Mason checked for injuries, and Harlow signaled for extraction. That was when the alarms went off. A single guard had spotted movement through a slit window, and within seconds the compound erupted in shouts and gunfire. Bullets tore through the walls, echoing in the narrow halls. The SEALs took positions, answering with disciplined bursts, but they were heavily outnumbered. Falcon didn't hesitate. She grabbed the journalist by the arm, shoved him toward Mason, and barked a single order, "Move!" Her voice cut through the chaos sharper than gunfire. She led them down twisting staircases, through passages the men would never have found on their own, and out into a rear courtyard where the walls were lower. The enemy was closing fast, boots pounding, rifles clattering, but Falcon scaled the wall first and dropped a rope she carried coiled around her waist. "Climb," she commanded, and though bullets cracked against the stone inches away, every man obeyed. They spilled into the desert just as trucks roared to life inside the compound. The enemy was pursuing, headlights slicing the darkness, engines howling. The SEALs ran in a staggered formation, carrying the weakened journalist between them, but the vehicles were gaining. Falcon sprinted ahead, faster than anyone thought possible, her movements precise, conserving energy while pushing the pace. She veered toward a ridge where jagged rocks jutted from the sand, and the SEALs followed without question. She led them through a narrow cut in the stone where the trucks could not follow, and just when it seemed the pursuit might overwhelm them, she knelt by a cluster of rocks and pulled something from beneath the sand, a cache of explosives already wired and waiting. Without a word she set the detonator, her hands steady even as the headlights bore down on them, and when the trucks entered the choke point she pressed the trigger. The desert lit with fire, a thunderclap rolling across the night as vehicles erupted in flame, scattering metal and men into the sky. The SEALs stared in shock, half deafened by the blast, but Falcon didn't even glance back. She was already moving, guiding them deeper into the labyrinth of ridges until the sounds of pursuit faded into silence. They reached a safe house by dawn, a small abandoned hut on the edge of the desert where Falcon finally allowed them to rest. The journalist collapsed with exhaustion, Mason tending his wounds, while the rest of the team took turns on watch. Harlow found Falcon outside, perched on a rock as the rising sun painted the sky in fire. "You knew they'd chase us that way," he said quietly. "You planted those charges ahead of time." She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not ahead of time," she replied. "Years ago. I knew one day I would need them." Harlow studied her, unsettled by the implication. She wasn't improvising. She had prepared for this long before the SEALs ever arrived, as though she had seen the mission coming. "Who are you?" he asked finally, the question heavy with all the others he hadn't voiced. Falcon turned to him then, and for the first time her eyes softened, though only slightly. "Someone who cannot afford to lose," she said. Nothing more. The days that followed blurred into a constant battle for survival. The enemy had been humiliated and they wanted blood. Every village, every crossing, every canyon became a gauntlet. Yet Falcon guided them through with unerring precision, always one step ahead, always finding a way where none should exist. The SEALs began to whisper among themselves when she was out of earshot, trading theories about her past. Some said she was ex-military, maybe a rogue operative left behind after some classified war. Others swore she had been born in the desert, raised by tribes who knew every grain of sand, taught by elders long since gone. Rodriguez joked once that maybe she wasn't even human, just a spirit the desert had conjured to lead them, but no one laughed. Because every time death closed in, Falcon was there, pulling them back from the brink. One night, when exhaustion pressed heavy and even the hard-bitten SEALs felt the edges of despair, Falcon told them a story. She didn't speak often, but her voice carried them through the darkness like a lifeline. She spoke of a village long ago, a place swallowed by war, where a young girl watched her family torn apart by men who came in the night. She spoke of fire, of screams, of the sky filled with smoke, and how she ran into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She spoke of how the desert didn't kill her but shaped her, taught her to see what others missed, to hear the whispers in the silence, to strike like the falcon that circles high and falls fast. She never said outright that the girl was her, but the men knew. And they understood then why she fought, why she guided them, why she never allowed herself to rest. Her war had started long before theirs, and it would not end until the last shadow of that night was gone. By the time they neared extraction, the SEALs no longer thought of Falcon as just a guide. She was part of them, the unseen leader whose instincts had saved their lives more times than they could count. Yet Harlow felt a weight pressing on him, a sense that this mission was more than it appeared, that Falcon's path was not finished with theirs. He suspected she had brought them this far not just for the journalist's sake, but for her own war. And though he couldn't yet see what storm lay ahead, he knew one truth as solid as the desert stone. The SEALs had learned why she was called Falcon, but they had not yet seen the full measure of her wings. The journey to the extraction point became a crucible that tested not just their bodies but their resolve. And though the SEALs were trained to endure the harshest conditions, it was Falcon who carried them through. The desert grew harsher with each passing mile, the heat like a living creature clawing at their throats by day and the cold sinking into their bones by night. Food ran low, water even lower, and the journalist they carried with them was weakening despite Mason's constant care. Still, Falcon pressed forward, her stride never faltering, her eyes always searching, scanning, calculating. She seemed untouched by the elements, as if the desert itself sustained her, and the men began to whisper among themselves that she was less human than elemental, some force carved out of sand and fire. They trusted her more than they trusted their own maps or radios, because time and again, when choices had to be made between one valley or another, one ridge or the next, she always led them down the path that brought them through alive. On the fourth night after the compound raid, when they were still 2 days from the extraction zone, they made camp in the ruins of an old caravanserai. The crumbling stone walls offered shelter from the wind, but the air carried unease. Falcon moved through the shadows with the same restless vigilance as always, pausing at each opening, staring out into the night as though expecting something. Harlow finally approached her, his exhaustion hidden beneath the iron discipline of command but his mind weighed down by questions. "What are you seeing?" he asked quietly. She turned her head slightly, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of her face. "They are not far," she murmured. "The ones who survived the fire at the canyon. They've been following us since, watching, waiting." Harlow felt the weight of her words settle into his chest like stone. He trusted her senses now as much as his own. If Falcon said hunters were near, then death was already circling. Later that night the hunters came. The SEALs were shaken from restless sleep by the sound of distant engines and the faint glint of headlights bouncing across the horizon. There were too many to fight, too many to outrun with a weakened man in their care. Rodriguez cursed under his breath, checking his rifle, but Falcon stood in the center of the ruin, calm as a statue. "They want me," she said, her voice carrying in the cold air. The team froze, her words heavy with an implication none of them wanted to consider. "What do you mean?" Harlow demanded. Falcon looked at him then, and for the first time her mask cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "These men are not chasing you. They do not care about the American. They hunt the Falcon because I have cut them deeper than you know." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the approaching roar of engines. "Then you're part of this war," Harlow said, his voice low. She didn't deny it. Instead she pulled the scarf tighter around her head and slung her rifle across her back. "Get him to safety. That is your mission. I will draw them off." The SEALs reacted instantly, protests erupting like gunfire. Rodriguez swore she wouldn't last 10 minutes alone against that many. Mason pleaded that abandoning her was suicide for them all, and even the stoic Daniels shook his head in disbelief. But Falcon didn't argue. She simply began walking toward the darkness where the enemy closed in. Her confidence, her terrifying certainty, made it clear she had already chosen. Harlow grabbed her arm, his grip iron. "We don't leave people behind," he growled. For a moment their eyes locked, two wills forged by war colliding in the night. Then Falcon leaned closer, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "You don't understand, Marcus. If you stay you will all die. Let me carry this fight. That is what I was born for." She pulled free, leaving him clutching empty air, and moved toward the desert beyond the walls. The decision tore at him, but Harlow knew he had seconds to act. The journalist's frail body could not withstand capture again, and their orders had been clear. Mission first, survival second. Yet as he watched Falcon disappear into the darkness, the weight of abandoning her felt like a betrayal deeper than any he had known. He gave the order to move, his voice tight, and the SEALs lifted the journalist and followed him into the opposite direction of the engines. But none of them felt right, none of them believed they were doing anything but running from a storm they didn't deserve to escape. Behind them, in the distance, the night exploded with gunfire. Falcon's war cry, sharp and piercing, cut through the desert like a blade, and the SEALs paused for half a breath, hearts clenched. Then they forced themselves onward, every step heavy with guilt. Through the ruins of a dried-up riverbed they pushed, stumbling under the weight of exhaustion and conscience. The firefight raged behind them, growing fainter with each mile, until finally silence returned. The SEALs exchanged glances, none daring to say what haunted them all. That silence meant one of two things, and neither offered comfort. When dawn broke, they collapsed under the shade of a twisted acacia tree. The journalist coughed weakly, Mason forcing water down his throat, while Rodriguez paced like a caged animal, muttering curses at the horizon. "We left her," he said bitterly. "We left her to die for us." No one answered, but the shame in their silence was louder than words. It was late afternoon when the impossible happened. Falcon returned. She emerged from the heat haze of the desert, walking toward them as if she had been carved out of the horizon itself. Her clothes were torn, blood streaked her arms and face, but her stride was steady, her eyes fierce. In one hand she carried a rifle she hadn't had before, and strapped across her back was another weapon taken from her enemies. The SEALs rose to their feet in stunned disbelief as she reached them, her expression unreadable. "They won't follow again," she said simply, and dropped the rifle into the sand. None of the men asked how she had done it, none wanted to know the details. The look in her eyes told them enough. Whatever had happened in that desert was something only the Falcon could survive. From that moment on, the bond between them was no longer professional necessity but something deeper. The SEALs had seen courage before, sacrifice and skill beyond measure, but what Falcon had done was something they couldn't name. She had gone into hell alone and returned not just alive but victorious. She had proven that the legends whispered about her were not exaggerations but shadows of the truth. Even Rodriguez, whose tongue never rested, spoke with reverence now. They walked behind her not because they were ordered to, but because she was the only one who could lead them through the fire. That night, as they camped in silence, Falcon sat apart as usual, cleaning her rifle with calm, methodical movements. Harlow finally approached, settling beside her without speaking for a long time. The desert stretched endless around them, the stars sharp against the sky, and for once even he struggled for words. Finally he said, "We thought you were gone." Falcon didn't look up. "Not yet," she replied. "Not until the desert takes me on its own terms." Her voice was steady, but he heard something beneath it, a weariness carved too deep for words. He wanted to ask why she fought, why she carried this burden alone, but he knew the answer already. It was in her name, in the way she moved, in the silence of the men who followed her. She was the Falcon, and this war was hers. The extraction point was still a day's march away, and though the SEALs had regained a measure of hope after Falcon's impossible return, the weight of the desert pressed harder with each step. The journalist's condition worsened. Fever gripped him, his breathing shallow and erratic, forcing Mason to carry him on his shoulders for long stretches. Every mile seemed to stretch into eternity, and though the SEALs were no strangers to hardship, the tension of being hunted made each grain of sand feel like a blade against their skin. Falcon walked at the front as always, her stride steady, her eyes forever searching the horizon. She spoke little, but when she did it was only to give instructions. When to pause, when to move, where to place a foot. It was as if she carried an invisible map in her mind, one that no satellite or drone could ever replicate. The men began to realize that Falcon was not guiding them merely to safety. She was teaching them, sharpening their senses, forcing them to see the desert as she saw it. That night they took shelter in the shell of an old village, nothing left but stone foundations and the bones of walls that had long since fallen to time. The wind whistled through the ruins like the cries of ghosts, and the men settled uneasily into their watch rotations. Falcon, as always, climbed to the highest point and kept vigil, her figure outlined against the starlight. Harlow joined her after a while, carrying 2 canteens of water. He handed one to her, but she only shook her head. "Save it for the boy," she said, nodding toward where Mason tended the journalist. "You need it more than I do," Harlow countered, but she didn't reply, only turning her gaze back to the horizon. After a moment he asked the question that had haunted him since the night she vanished into the enemy. "Why do they fear you so much?" She was silent for so long he thought she would ignore him, but then she spoke, her voice soft, carried by the wind. "Because I have taken from them more than they can ever replace. Because I have hunted them as they hunt others. And because they know I will never stop." There was no boast in her tone, only fact. Harlow studied her profile, realizing then that she was not simply a guide or a warrior, she was a force built out of vengeance, and her war was carved into her bones. The following morning, before dawn, Falcon roused them with a curt command to move. The urgency in her voice needed no explanation, and within minutes they were on their feet, packs strapped, weapons ready. The desert was cloaked in pre-dawn darkness, a heavy silence settling over the land, but Falcon's posture was taut, her eyes sharper than ever. Hours later, as the first light bled across the sand, the reason became clear. A column of trucks appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun. They were too far to identify, but Falcon's reaction told them everything. "They know where we're going," she said, her jaw tight. "They'll cut us off before we reach the rendezvous." Panic flickered in Rodriguez's eyes, but Falcon silenced him with a look. "We'll change course. Through the canyons." Harlow hesitated. "That'll add hours. Extraction is timed to the second." Falcon didn't flinch. Better late than dead. The SEALs exchanged glances, then nodded. They had learned to trust her, and so they followed. The canyons were treacherous, a maze of jagged stone and winding paths where echoes carried every sound tenfold. The heat radiating off the rock walls was suffocating, and more than once they had to stop to steady the journalist, whose fever worsened with every step. Falcon pressed them onward, pausing often to scan the ridgelines above. Twice she pulled them into narrow crevices moments before armed scouts appeared overhead, their voices echoing as they searched. Each time the SEALs held their breath, rifles ready, but Falcon's calm hand stilled them. She knew exactly when to move, when to wait, as though she had danced this labyrinth 1,000 times before. Harlow began to realize that her reputation wasn't just built on survival but on mastery. She knew these lands more intimately than anyone alive, and that knowledge was deadlier than any weapon. It was deep within the canyons that the ambush came. Gunfire erupted from above, the sound ricocheting like thunder through the stone corridors. The SEALs dove for cover, returning fire with disciplined bursts, but the enemy had the high ground. Dust and rock sprayed down as bullets chipped the canyon walls, the journalist screaming in fear as Mason shielded him with his body. Falcon moved without hesitation, sprinting along the canyon floor, her movements a blur. She scaled a jagged outcropping with impossible speed, vanishing into the rocks above. The SEALs covered her as best they could, suppressing fire raining upward, but their focus kept shifting to the woman whose shadow darted between stones like a phantom. Moments later, the enemy's fire began to falter, their shouts breaking into confusion. One by one the muzzle flashes above went silent, cut short by a single, precise crack. Falcon was hunting, her rifle speaking with the voice of death, each shot deliberate, each strike final. Within minutes the canyon fell silent except for the ringing in the SEAL's ears. Then she reappeared, dropping lightly from the rocks, calm as though she had simply walked a path no one else could see. "We move," she said. "They'll be back with more." By the time dusk fell, the team was frayed to the edge. Ammunition was low, supplies nearly gone, and the journalist was barely conscious. They collapsed beneath an overhang, exhaustion carving lines into every face. The men were hardened warriors, but even they could feel despair creeping in. Falcon knelt by the journalist, placing a hand on his fevered brow. Her eyes softened, and she whispered words in a language none of them understood, something that carried the weight of comfort and promise. When she rose, her face was steel again, but the glimpse of humanity lingered in their minds. Harlow approached her once more, his voice weary but firm. "You can't carry this forever," he said. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of pain crossed her features. "I don't carry it," she replied. "It carries me." Then she turned away, her silhouette framed against the fading light, a solitary figure bound to a war none of them could truly comprehend. That night the SEALs lay awake, each man haunted by her words, each one realizing that they were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were walking inside the legend of the Falcon, pulled into a story that had begun long before they arrived and would continue long after they left. For Harlow, the truth settled heavy on his chest. Their mission was no longer about extraction alone. It was about witnessing something rare, something terrifying and beautiful, the embodiment of a spirit that refused to break. And as he closed his eyes, listening to the whisper of the desert wind, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever tomorrow brought, they would not face it as a team of SEALs alone, but as brothers who now carried the shadow of the Falcon in their hearts. The 5th day on the run began with silence so heavy it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that told seasoned men something was watching them. The canyons gave way to open flats where the sand stretched endless under a pale morning sun, and though the air seemed still, Falcon never stopped glancing over her shoulder. The SEALs followed close, weary but alert, every nerve stretched taut after days of pursuit. They had learned to read her body language, and when her stride shortened, when her head tilted slightly as though catching a sound beyond their ears, they tightened their formation without a word. The journalist was fading quickly, his fever robbing him of strength, and Mason struggled to keep him upright. Harlow considered calling in for an early extraction, but Falcon shut the thought down with a single look. "You light the sky too soon," she warned, "and they will descend on us before help arrives. We are not ghosts yet. We leave no trail." Her authority was absolute now, even over men trained never to yield command, because she had earned it with fire and blood. By midday the heat was unbearable, shimmering waves rising off the sand like a living thing, and Rodriguez muttered curses under his breath as sweat poured down his face. Falcon led them toward a cluster of boulders that offered shade, and for a moment the men collapsed, grateful for even a sliver of relief. The journalist lay limp in Mason's arms, his breath shallow. "He won't make it another day," Mason said grimly. Falcon knelt beside him, her eyes sharp, calculating. She tore strips from her scarf, soaked them with the last of her water, and pressed them against the man's skin. "He will make it," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "He has to. If he dies, everything we've carried means nothing." The conviction in her voice steadied them, as though her will alone could drag the man back from the edge. Harlow watched her, struck again by the intensity that burned in her eyes. She had seen death enough times to know its weight, but she refused to surrender to it now. As they rested, Falcon rose suddenly, tilting her head as though listening. The SEALs froze, hands on rifles, waiting. Then they heard it too, the faint thrum of helicopters far in the distance. Relief surged in Rodriguez's face, but Falcon shook her head sharply. Not ours. The word was enough to drain the hope from their veins. Enemy air support meant they were closing in faster than expected, sweeping the desert in search patterns that would pin them down. Falcon motioned for them to move, urgency sharpened in her every step. She led them into a dry wadi, the walls high enough to mask their silhouettes from above, guiding them deeper into its winding path. 4 hours they pushed through the shifting sand, every bend a gamble between concealment and trap, but Falcon seemed to know the wadi's secrets, always choosing the route that kept the helicopters passing overhead without pause. By nightfall they had slipped free, the thrum of rotors fading into the distance. The SEALs looked at her with something beyond respect now. It was faith, raw and unshakable. That night, around the dim glow of a shielded light, the men ate in silence, conserving energy. Falcon sat apart as always, sharpening the edge of her knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound rasped in the air, steady as her heartbeat. Rodriguez broke the silence first, his voice low, almost reverent. You're not just surviving out here. You're at war with them. Falcon paused, the blade glinting in the faint light, then she spoke without looking up. They took everything from me once. My family, my people, my home. They thought I would break. But I am still here, and they fear that more than anything. Her words were quiet but carried the weight of truth that silenced them all. The SEALs knew vengeance when they saw it, but hers was something purer, deeper, a vow carved into her soul. Harlow studied her profile, realizing she wasn't guiding them only out of duty but because their mission aligned with her own endless war. She needed them to reach extraction, not just for the journalist's sake but because every enemy they killed, every mile they gained, was another strike in the shadow battle she had been waging for years. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by distant sounds and dreams of fire, and when dawn broke, Falcon was already moving. The final stretch to the extraction zone lay ahead, but it would not be simple. The rendezvous point was an old salt flat, exposed for miles in every direction. To reach it meant crossing open ground with nowhere to hide, a death sentence if the enemy was watching. Falcon studied the land in silence, then turned to Harlow. We draw them away. Split them, confuse them. Only then will your bird land safely. The SEALs bristled at the thought. Splitting meant weakness, meant exposing themselves. But Falcon explained with crisp precision, outlining paths through the ridges that would force the enemy to chase ghosts, dividing their strength. She would lead one diversion herself, of course, because that was who she was. The SEALs argued, voices tight with fear and frustration, but in the end they knew she was right. Harlow felt the weight of command press heavier than ever as he gave the order, his chest tight with the knowledge that he might be sending her to her death again. They moved at dusk, shadows stretching long across the sand. Falcon took Rodriguez and Daniels with her, slipping into the ridges with the speed of hunters, while Harlow, Mason, and the weakened journalist made for the flat. The night filled with echoes, gunfire in the distance, shouts carried on the wind, flares arching into the sky. Falcon's diversion was working. Enemy forces swarmed toward her position, their engines roaring as they chased the phantom who had haunted them for years. Harlow pushed harder, dragging the journalist through the open ground, praying the deception held long enough. Minutes stretched into lifetimes, every heartbeat a countdown. At last, the thunder of rotors filled the sky, not enemy this time, but the blessed sound of their extraction. A black hawk swooped low, its lights cutting the darkness, and the SEALs waved their signal flares high. Relief surged through them as the bird touched down, dust and sand whipping in the storm of its blades. They loaded the journalist first, Mason climbing in after to stabilize him, while Harlow and the others provided cover. But even as the roar of safety filled their ears, Harlow's gaze locked on the horizon. Falcon was still out there, somewhere in the chaos of gunfire and pursuit. His gut twisted, torn between duty and the instinct that screamed not to leave her behind. The pilot shouted over the roar, "We can't wait much longer." The SEALs looked to Harlow, their faces drawn with the same conflict. Mission first, that was the creed. But the Falcon had become more than an ally, more than a guide. She had become part of them, and the thought of leaving her in the desert felt like betrayal etched into their souls. Harlow clenched his jaw, his decision burning through him like fire. He signaled for the team to hold the bird. "She's coming back," he said, though it was as much prayer as certainty. "She'll come back." And as if the desert had heard him, a figure emerged from the haze. Falcon, bloodied and dust-caked, sprinted across the flat, rifle slung low, eyes blazing with feral determination. Behind her, headlights bobbed as enemy trucks tore after her, gunfire raking the sand. The SEALs opened fire, cutting down the lead vehicles, but Falcon never slowed. She reached the Black Hawk in a burst of speed, Rodriguez and Daniels hauling her aboard as bullets clanged off the fuselage. "Go!" Harlow roared, and the bird lifted, engines straining as it clawed into the sky. Below, the desert receded into a blur of fire and shadow, enemy forces scattering in frustration as their prey escaped. Inside the chopper, the SEALs slumped in exhaustion, the journalists secured, weapons lowered at last. Falcon sat apart as always, her chest heaving, blood streaking her arms. Yet her eyes burned with the same unyielding fire, a predator who had survived another hunt. The men looked at her with awe, and Harlow knew then that her legend was sealed in their hearts forever. The Black Hawk cut through the desert night like a blade, its rotors drowning out thought, its fuselage shuddering as it climbed higher into safer airspace. But inside the cabin there was no celebration, only the heavy silence of men too exhausted to feel triumph, their faces caked in dust and blood, their eyes hollow from days of pursuit. The journalist lay strapped down, unconscious but breathing, Mason keeping a hand on his pulse, while Rodriguez slumped against the wall, every muscle trembling with fatigue. Harlow sat opposite Falcon, and though he tried to study the maps in his lap, his eyes kept pulling back to her. She sat with her back straight despite the wounds seeping crimson down her arms, her face half shadowed by the dim red cabin lights, her gaze fixed out the open door as though the desert still called to her. There was something untamed about her even in the safety of steel and flight, something that told Harlow she belonged to the wild places and not to the machines of war. He wanted to ask her why she risked herself so completely for them, strangers bound to her by chance, but the words stuck in his throat, because deep down he already knew, she had no other way to live. For her, survival was not enough. She had to fight, to claw at the darkness until it bled. The helicopter jolted as the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "Brace yourselves, we've got incoming radar locks." A curse tore from Daniels as he gripped his rifle tighter, though there was nothing it could do against missiles in the sky. The crew fired countermeasures, flares blazing into the night like falling stars, and for agonizing seconds they waited, hearts pounding, until the radar threat faded. They had been lucky this time, but luck was a currency that ran out fast. When they finally crossed into friendly airspace, the cabin seemed to exhale as one, though no one dared speak too soon. The bird touched down on the forward operating base just before dawn, the light staining the horizon in bruised colors, and the SEALs climbed out, their boots heavy, their bodies breaking under the weight of what they had endured. Medics rushed forward to take the journalist, then to Falcon, but she shook them off with a sharp gesture. "See to him first," she said, her voice flat, and though the medics insisted, she stepped back until they had no choice but to obey. Only when the journalist was loaded onto a stretcher did she allow herself to be checked, and even then she refused the stretcher they offered, walking on her own feet to the medical tent as though being carried would have been a betrayal of her name. Harlow watched her go, something tight twisting in his chest, because he realized that even in victory Falcon was already preparing for the next fight. Inside the command tent, the SEALs delivered their report, every detail logged, every casualty noted, and when the debrief was over their commander leaned back in silence. "You men should be dead," he said finally, awe mixing with disbelief. "Whoever she is, she kept you alive." The SEALs exchanged glances, each of them knowing words could never capture what Falcon had done. She wasn't just a guide or a fighter, she had been the spirit that kept them moving when their bodies wanted to give up, the force that defied death itself. That night, while the base settled into its routine hum, Falcon sat outside the perimeter fence, the desert stretching endless beyond the wire, her eyes following the wind as if it carried voices only she could hear. Harlow approached quietly, sitting beside her without asking, and for a long time they said nothing, the silence between them full but not heavy. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "They call you Falcon. Why?" She glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time he could remember. "Because a falcon doesn't belong in cages. You can train it, feed it, call it yours, but the sky always calls it back." Her gaze returned to the horizon, and Harlow understood she wasn't talking about birds anymore. She was telling him that no matter how many lives she saved, how many battles she fought, she would never belong to bases or missions or chains of command. She was wild, unbound, driven by her own oath, and that was what made her unstoppable. He wanted to tell her that she belonged with them anyway, that she had earned more than a life of endless wandering, But before he could speak, alarms blared across the base, sharp and urgent. An attack was coming, fast. Falcon rose instantly, shoulders squaring, eyes blazing with the same fire he had seen in the desert. "Then let them come," she said, and in that moment Harlow realized the war would never end for her, not until she herself became part of the desert she fought to reclaim. The alarms wailed across the forward operating base with a piercing urgency that sent soldiers scrambling from bunks, floodlights snapping to life as sirens carved through the pre-dawn air, and the SEALs who had barely begun to taste rest were already on their feet, rifles in hand, eyes hard, because war gave no mercy and it never waited for men to recover. Falcon moved with them, unhesitating, her body still bleeding from old wounds but her spirit unbroken, as if the sound of danger gave her more strength than rest ever could. Harlow barked quick orders, directing the SEALs to defensive positions along the southern wall where the first reports placed enemy movement, but Falcon didn't wait for permission, scaling the sand berm with fluid grace, her rifle already shouldered, scanning the desert through the haze of dust and artificial light. Out there, beyond the perimeter, shadows danced, convoys of trucks, silhouettes of fighters moving with deadly intent, and above them, the faint hum of drones prowling the sky. The enemy had not wasted time. They had tracked the Black Hawk, followed its trail back to the base, and now they meant to strike before the journalist's story could ever leave this desert. As mortars whistled overhead, exploding in thunderous bursts that rattled the walls, the base erupted into chaos, but within that chaos Falcon became something else entirely. Her movements were precise, sharp, a predator's instinct guiding her aim as she dropped target after target with merciless accuracy, her rifle an extension of her will. The SEALs glanced at her between volleys, the awe on their faces unhidden now, because they saw clearly that she wasn't just surviving this fight, she was shaping it. Every shot she fired slowed the advance, every command she shouted in her clipped, fierce tone brought order where panic threatened to spread, and though the base commander had officers screaming into radios, it was Falcon's presence that steadied the line. Rodriguez swore under his breath as a rocket slammed into the outer barricade, sending fire into the sky, and yelled, "We're not holding this without her." Daniels gritted his teeth, firing bursts into the oncoming swarm, but his eyes kept tracking Falcon, as though her survival meant more to him than his own. Harlow felt the weight of command pressing harder than ever, every decision a matter of life or death, but he could not deny that Falcon's instincts outpaced his own training. When she signaled for him to shift his men toward the eastern flank, he obeyed without hesitation, and minutes later a mortar strike obliterated the ground they had just vacated, proof again that her awareness bordered on something supernatural. For nearly an hour the battle raged, the desert itself trembling under the fury of gunfire and explosives, until finally reinforcements from nearby outposts roared in with armored vehicles, their heavy guns turning the tide. The enemy, realizing their chance was slipping, unleashed one final wave of desperate fire before retreating into the dunes, leaving behind wreckage, blood, and silence broken only by the ringing in soldiers' ears. The base smoldered in the aftermath, craters marking the sand, the acrid stench of smoke and death hanging heavy. Medics moved through the carnage, dragging the wounded, covering the dead, and in the midst of it all Falcon stood on the berm, her chest heaving, her face streaked with soot and blood, eyes still locked on the horizon as though waiting for the enemy to return. Harlow approached her slowly, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "You saved this base," he said, and though his words carried gratitude, they also carried something heavier, a recognition that without her, every man here might already be a corpse. Falcon turned to him, her expression unreadable, and after a long silence she answered, "No. You saved it because you chose to fight. I only showed you how not to die." But Harlow wasn't fooled by her humility. He saw the exhaustion trembling in her limbs, the unspoken cost of carrying so many lives on her shoulders, and he knew that she was more than she admitted. Later, in the command tent where officers argued over strategy and paperwork tried to quantify the night's losses, the SEALs sat together in a quiet corner, every man haunted but alive, and it was Rodriguez who finally said aloud what they had all been thinking. "She's not just Falcon. She's the reason any of us walk out of here." Daniels nodded, his jaw tight. "And yet she'll vanish. I can feel it. She won't stay." The words sat heavy in the air and none of them argued because they knew he was right. Falcon didn't belong to bases or armies, not even to the SEALs who owed her their lives. She belonged to the desert, to the war she had sworn never to end, and they were only chapters in her endless story. That night, while others tended to their wounds and buried their dead, Harlow found her again at the edge of the perimeter, standing where the floodlights met the shadows, her silhouette sharp against the stars. He joined her in silence, and after a long while he spoke, his voice low. "You don't have to keep fighting alone." She looked at him then, her eyes soft for the first time, touched by something almost fragile, but the softness vanished quickly, replaced by the steel he had come to know. "I was born in this war," she said quietly. "And I will die in it. That is the way of the Falcon." Harlow wanted to protest, to tell her she deserved more than endless battles, but he saw the finality in her gaze and knew words would never change her. She was already part of the legend that spread with whispers, the woman who guided warriors through death and came out the other side unbroken. And as the desert wind swept across the base, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and freedom, Harlow understood that no matter what happened next, the SEALs would carry her story with them forever. The desert was quiet again in the days after the attack, but it was the deceptive quiet that every soldier recognized, the kind that hummed with the promise of violence just beyond the horizon. And though the forward operating base had survived, the scars of that night lingered in both steel and flesh. Repairs began at once, bulldozers clearing wreckage, engineers shoring up walls, medics working day and night over the wounded, yet in every corner of the camp the name on every whisper was hers. Falcon. The woman who had stood unflinching against fire and fury, who had led the SEALs through death's teeth and then held the base itself from falling into ruin. She had become a myth even as she still walked among them, but she seemed untouched by the reverence, slipping through the camp with the same quiet presence, helping where needed, refusing the luxury of rest or recognition. Harlow watched her often, torn between admiration and worry, because though her body remained unbowed, he saw the weight she carried in the set of her shoulders, in the way her eyes always scanned the horizon as if expecting it to bleed enemies at any moment. When the journalist finally regained consciousness, weak but alive, he whispered through cracked lips of what he had seen, his words fevered but clear. "They need to know, the world needs to know about her." He tried to write, his trembling hands clutching a pen, but every sentence seemed to collapse into the same truth. She was more than a fighter, she was the spirit of survival itself. The SEALs tried to convince Falcon to let him tell her story, to let her name reach beyond the desert, but she only shook her head. "Names tie you down. I am no one. Let him write of survival, of courage, of hope. But not of me. I am the shadow. I am the Falcon." Her refusal frustrated them because they wanted the world to understand the miracle of her existence, but at the same time they knew she was right. Legends grew stronger without details, myths more enduring when faceless. She would not let herself be caged by fame any more than by command. Days passed, and the SEALs received orders to rotate out, their mission officially declared complete, the journalist to be flown home under heavy guard, his story expected to light a fire across nations. On the morning of departure, the SEALs assembled by the helicopter, packs strapped, weapons cleaned, the weight of survival pressing against their chests. Harlow searched for Falcon, half expecting her to join them, to climb aboard and vanish into the sky with them, but she was not there. He found her instead at the edge of the camp, where desert met wire, her figure still and solitary. He approached slowly, his boots crunching in the sand, and when she turned her head he saw the resolve already etched into her face. "You're not coming with us," he said, though it was not a question. Falcon shook her head. "This is your war to leave. Mine has no end." Harlow swallowed hard, struggling against the ache in his throat. "You could start over. You've done enough. More than enough." For a heartbeat her eyes softened, touched by a flicker of emotion that seemed almost like longing, but it vanished quickly, replaced by the unyielding fire he had come to know. Falcons don't start over. They return to the sky again and again until their wings no longer carry them. That is who I am. The wind swept between them, carrying grains of sand like whispered prayers, and Harlow wanted to argue, to tell her that she had earned peace, that she deserved a life beyond blood and battle, but he knew his words would never change her. She was already written into the desert itself, woven into its harsh beauty and endless war. All he could do was honor her choice. He reached out, gripping her hand firmly, a silent acknowledgement between warriors, and in that moment he felt the raw strength she carried, the same strength that had dragged them through hell and back. "If the world ever asks me who saved us," he said quietly, "I'll tell them the Falcon still flies." She met his gaze, and for the first time her lips curved in a small, genuine smile. "Then tell them to look to the horizon. That's where I'll be." When he returned to the helicopter, Rodriguez and Daniels looked at him, eyes questioning, but he only shook his head. They understood without words. As the rotors thundered and the Black Hawk lifted, the SEALs pressed their faces to the windows, scanning the shrinking base below, but Falcon was already gone, melted into the desert's vast embrace. Perhaps she had never belonged to them at all, only borrowed herself to their cause for a brief, burning moment. The journalist would carry his story home, the SEALs would carry their scars, and nations would argue over strategy and politics, but none of it could capture the truth they had lived. The truth was a woman with fire in her eyes and wings no cage could hold, a woman who fought not for medals or orders but because she could not do otherwise. They called her Falcon, and the SEALs soon learned why, because she was the wind that carried them through death, the predator that struck fear into their enemies, the spirit that refused to be broken. And long after wars ended and men grew old, her legend would remain, whispered in deserts and told in barracks, not as a name in a book but as a force in the memory of those who had lived because of her. For some, she would always be a question: who was she, where did she come from, what became of her? But for the SEALs the answer was simple. She was Falcon and she was eternal. The end.